Hi, my name's Anne from Orchid Systems, and today I'm going to run through EFT processing for accounts payable and accounts receivable. But first of all, EFT processing, is this the correct product for you? Do you need to send payments electronically to your vendors or employees, collect receipts from your customers via direct debit, or send positive pay files to your bank? How confident are you that all your cash movements are secure and would stand up to an audit? Would you like to cut costs and improve efficiency through increased automation, enhance audibility, and reduce exposure to fraud by moving away from paper checks or streamlining positive pay file processing? If this appeals to you, then EFT processing might be the correct product for you. EFT processing allows you to create electronic files for your bank. These could be payments, refunds, or direct debits. At this stage, we have over 550 bank formats, and we're adding on average one new format per week. The formats are user definable, and we add new formats free of charge. EFT processing provides enhanced security around your cash payments. It allows you to encrypt your vendors, customers, and your own bank and branch number. Changes to customer and vendor EFT details are logged, the date and time, who did the change, from what, and to what. You can configure a two-level security for staff, one person being allowed to enter EFT details and a second person being able to approve EFT details, thereby getting the separation of duties around approving the EFT details. Audit logs and the date and time of all EFT files are created, including all the details from the file. And you can also put passwords on the PDF remittance advices. And if you're using accounts receivable and direct debits, you can use EFT processing to automatically create a receipt batch based from outstanding balances or all invoices not yet paid with a particular terms code or all customers in a particular group, and so on. And any documents that are excluded from the create receipt batch run will be audited. You can also use EFT processing to update the invoice due date. So if an invoice is incorrectly posted with the incorrect due date, you can use EFT processing to change the due date. And there's a full audit trail of who changed which date from which document, from what, and to what. In this training video, we're going to first activate the module, look at the licensing, and run through the configuration options. Then we're going to look at the EFT transactions, the frequently used reports, and the options in periodic processing. We're also going to review the EFT file formats and discuss how and when you'd use a user format. And we're going to look at the sample remittance advices for vendors, customers, and AR refunds. First of all, you would download EFT processing from our website and then install the programs. After installing, you go to Administrative Services and activate the module. Then it's best to look at your EFT license and make sure that you've got the correct license, be it AP and AR, or if you're using EFT for payroll, make sure you've got the payroll options, or if you're using both, you need the AP, AR, and payroll options. And then we're going to run through the security options in EFT, all the configuration options in the IET setup options. We're going to run through setting up EFT banks, EFT vendors, EFT customers, email messages, and receipt selection codes. After downloading the Install Shield from our website, you can run the Install Shield. When running for the first time, you will be prompted for a serial number and an activation code. If you do not yet have a serial number and activation code, you can use the NFR serial numbers from our website as well. And then key in the serial number and activation code after you receive it. After installing, you can go into the appropriate company and activate the module. After activating, you can go to the license screen and check the license you have. This particular license is for AP and AR. If you have a license for payroll as well, you will see payroll here too, or if you only have a license for payroll, you will only see payroll here. It is recommended that you use our visual process flow in order to do your configuration and setup. To activate the visual process flow, you would go to Admin Services and assign the visual process flow to those users that you want to see the EFT setup. And I'm going to select EFT Processing AP and AR. You set the EFT security groups in the same place as you do with all the Sage 300 core modules. And most of these groups are self-explanatory. The two I'm going to call out is the Edit Vendor EFT Details Setup and Edit Customer EFT Details Setup, and the Approve. With the Edit, you are able to create and amend vendor and customer EFT details, but when you do, the status becomes entered, and it's only people with the ability to approve and view the unencrypted vendor bank account details that can change the status from entered to active, thereby having two-step or separation of duties with the entry and approval of the EFT vendor details and customer details. When first opening the EFT options or after installing a product update from EFT, you might see the loading file types such as we're seeing here. What this means is that the first time the formats are loaded from the formats.ini into the database. And if you ever open the EFT options or run create EFT file and EFT checks the formats.ini on the disk as opposed to the version of the formats.ini that's in the database. And if the formats.ini has been updated, either because we've included a new format and sent it to you, or you've installed a product update with the later version of the formats.ini, then it will be reloaded into the options. We're first going to look at the EFT options for AP. These first four options refer to the way in which you can create an EFT file. If you allow an EFT file creation from a batch range, if you select yes here, then when you come to create an EFT file, you can select a from and to batch number. We would recommend doing a single file per batch because you get a nice audit trail with the batch total, the EFT file total, and the total that's been loaded up to the bank should all match. You can allow unposted batches to be selected for the EFT file. We would recommend that you do not select this option as you only send posted transactions to the bank, but if you want, you can allow unposted batches to be selected. You can also allow for selective payments to be sent to the bank. If you allow this option, then when you create EFT file, you can select certain entries from within the batch, not the entire batch. Again, because of the control of having a batch total matching the EFT file total, matching the bank total, we would suggest that you do not allow this or only selectively allow this when you need to send one payment through if the bank details were incorrect, for example, the first time the batch was sent. And the final configuration is in regards to whether your AP payment batch will contain only EFT payments or a mixture between EFT payments and checks. It is better to organize your AP payment batches for EFT payments only, and in which case you'd say display an error and abort the export. So if there's a payment to a vendor and the EFT vendor details cannot be found, then it will give an error message and stop exporting the batch. Whereas if you do mixed batches, you can say if the vendor is not defined in EFT, then skip the vendor and continue with the export. But this is not as secure as organizing your batches to be EFT payments only. Allow multiple vendor bank account details, one per EFT file type. Typically, you would not select this option. If you do select this option, it implies that for each bank account that you're paying from, you will have a different detail for the vendor. So if you're paying from bank account A, you'll use account 123. But if you're paying from bank account B, you use account 456. Typically, this scenario does not happen. So you would leave this option deselected. And then you can have multiple vendor bank accounts by remit to code, but not dependent on which bank you are paying from. For the default EFT vendor status, you can have the system create the status to be entered, active, or inactive. So if you do have a separation of duties with one user being able to enter the EFT vendor's details and a second user being able to make it active after verifying the details, then you would set it to entered. But if it's the same user who creates and approves the vendor's account details, then you would just leave the status as active. You can also have the system warn you if two EFT vendors are entered, two or more EFT vendors are entered with the same bank account details. So you could either ignore this, have a warning, or give an error message. So if you're using EFT vendors for employee expenses, then you might say set this to warn or ignore because you might have employees with the same bank account details. But if you are using it for vendors only and you're expecting to have an EFT vendor record per vendor, then you could set this to error to avoid people accidentally entering the same vendor twice. You can then choose to encrypt the vendor's bank account details, the branch and account number, in which case all users will only see asterisks and the last four digits of the bank branch number and bank account number, except for the user who has the security clearance to view the unencrypted BSB and account number details. You can also choose to apply a password to the PDF remittance advice. And if you do, you can use any field on the EFT vendor to build up the password. And if you're using passwords, you can have an overriding master password to be used in case the vendor forgets the PDF password. Just as you can set these controls for AP payment batches to vendors, you can do the same controls for AR refund batches, for refunds to customers, and AR receipt batches for direct debits to customers. The first four options refer to the way the EFT file is created. Firstly, do you allow the EFT file creation to be from a single batch at a time or from a range of batches? We would recommend using a single batch at a time. The EFT file total should match the AR direct debit or AR refund batch total and should match the file total imported into the bank. The second control is whether or not you allow unposted batches to be selected. We would recommend not allowing unposted batches to be selected. The next control to consider is whether or not you allow selective payments or refunds to be chosen from the batch, or whether the file is created based on the whole batch. And finally, if you are doing direct debits or receipt batches, which cover both EFT payments and non-EFT payments, you can set to skip the customer record and continue the export if the customer is not defined in EFT when you go create EFT file. Or we would recommend rather having your receipt batch being direct debits only or refunds via EFT only. And if the EFT customer record is not defined, then it's going to display an error and abort the export. If you allow multiple customer bank account details, one per EFT file type, then you are able to store bank account details for your EFT customer per bank account you're paying from. So if you're paying from HSBC, for example, you could use bank account 123, and if you are paying from Citibank, you could use bank account 456. But typically, you would leave this option turned off, and then you would just have one bank account details for your customer irrespective of your bank account that you're creating the file type for. You can also set a default status for EFT customers when they are created or amended, whether the status should become entered or whether the person creating the record or amending the record can make the status active or inactive. If you want a separation of duties around the EFT customer, then you can have the status as entered or inactive by default, and then only certain users have the authority to then review and make the EFT customer's bank record active. You can also have the system check if you have more than one EFT customer with the same bank account details. If that is found, you can either ignore that scenario or give a warning or give an error message. If you want to encrypt the customer's bank branch and account number, you can select this option. If you do select this option, then all users, except for the user who can view unencrypted bank and branch details, will see asterisks with the last 4 digits on the EFT customer screen and on all reports and on all inquiries. You can also optionally choose to apply a password to the PDF remittance advice. In constructing the password, you can use any field from the AR customer. For example, ID cust, which is the customer ID, and the field name must be enclosed in curly brackets. So this would be the customer ID and the left 3 digits of the customer name. If you want, you can apply a master password to the PDF remittance advice as well, and this is in case the customer forgets their password. The next configuration setting you need to set is the primary bank. It is based on the primary bank that the additional fields on the EFT customer and the EFT vendor are turned on. So this bank should be the superset or the extra fields bank that you might be using. If you only have one file type, you always do domestic payments, then you would choose the appropriate file type here. But if you do, for example, both domestic payments and wire payments, then here you would want to choose the wire payment layout. And you can also optionally decide to encrypt your own bank and branch account details. On the AP and AR email tab, you fill in the SMTP details if you want the remittance advices to be sent via SMTP. If you leave these fields blank, then we will use the way you have set up in Common Services for sending emails. But if you do use SMTP details here, you can control how many emails get sent per minute or per session if your email server restricts the number of emails you send per minute or per session. If you're wanting to send emails via SMTP, you would fill in the server name here. And if the default port is not being used, you would go colon and the port number that you want to use. The next 3 options need to be filled in with respect to the email server that you're using, the user ID, the password, whether or not encryption is required, and the email comes from. For the email comes from, some email servers insist on it and some email servers require it to be blank, but you need to check with your particular email server. If you want to CC or BCC yourselves with each of the remittance advices that are being sent, you can fill in an email address here. And in this case, I'm limiting the number of emails I send per minute to 30. You can always click Send Test Email to test that your email details are set up correctly. On the Default Advice tab, you can select the default crystal report to be used for the AP remittance advice, the AR direct debit advice, and the AR refund advice. You can select your own custom reports if you want to do amendments to these standard reports. For the global file system number, This option is used if you have a file system number in your bank format that needs to be consistent across multiple banks. So some banks allow you to have multiple bank accounts and run with the same file system number, in which case you can say in the bank format which of the global file system numbers to be used. And as always, on our options, we have an Updates tab, which you can click Check for Updates to make sure you're on the latest product update. After configuring the EFT options for AP and AR EFT files, you would go to configure your EFT banks. You can configure any one of the common services banks that you have for EFT processing. Let's start with the FC Bank. So when we choose the appropriate file type for the FC Bank, you will notice additional fields will be turned on here, and these standard field labels will be relabeled based on the requirements of the individual file type. So when we select the CAN CPA 005, we notice that this, which used to say BSB number, is now the financial institution ID and the account number, and we also need to fill in the destination data center code. So the EFT file type that you select for the bank can turn on additional fields and also relabel fields based on the terminology for the bank. When EFT creates the file, it can either create a file on a file share, or it can SFTP the file if the bank allows you to SFTP directly to the bank. But in our case, we're going to create the file. You can choose for the file naming convention whether you want to use a file sequence number, the batch number, or you want to have a fixed file name, in which case you can type in any one of these variables as part of the file name. But in my case, I'm going to just leave it as the batch number. And we're going to put the file on the C drive of this machine. And the file extension is going to be CPA. The CAN CPA 005 also needs an originator ID number. We can fill in the options for our payments and refunds, and if we're doing direct debits, we can fill in similar options for the receipt files. Quite often, if you're doing both direct debits and payments from the same bank account, they'll give you a different originator ID number for the two different types of payments or receipts. The second bank we're going to configure for EFT processing is this bank called EFT Clear. So this is a bank I've created in Common Services, but it's intended just as a clearing bank account, and I'm going to set it up here as a clearing bank account for my real bank account, CCB. What this means is when I do an AP payment or an AP payment batch against the EFT Clear, so I might have a payment batch for 10 or 12 payments for my vendors. When I post the batch, EFT is going to do a clearing entry, bank transfer between EFT Clear and CCB and do the withdrawal from CCB, but in total, not one withdrawal for each of the 12 original payments that were in the EFT clearing account. So this will assist you if your bank statement has one total amount for your EFT batch as opposed to one amount per payment. So all banks differ in how they show EFT payments on your bank statement. So you may want to use a clearing bank account so that just the total for the EFT batch shows against your bank account. And this file format, we may choose the same one again, or it might be a wire payment, or depending what your typical batch is for this particular bank. So even though I set this up as my default file type for this particular bank, if I can still override it at the time of creating the EFT file. So if the majority of my payments are going to be using this CAN CPA 005 format, at the time of creating the EFT file, I could still override for individual payment batches and choose the wire format if that's what I needed to do. And I would fill in the necessary details for the payments as well. After completing the EFT banks, you would fill in the EFT vendor details and the EFT customer details. So these field labels have been turned on based on the primary bank in EFT options. So for vendor 1200, I can set up individual bank account details for the different remit to codes if that's appropriate, or if I leave the remit to code blank, then it will just use the vendor's bank account details. The auto-generated remittance password for this particular vendor will be 1200 CHL, but I could amend that and have a specific password for this vendor only, but I'm going to leave it as my auto-generated one from the formula on my EFT options. For the sending of remittance advices, you can choose whether you want to send it to the accounts payable vendor delivery method, which might be print or the vendor's contact email or the vendor's email, or if you want to, you can have a specific email address on the EFT vendor record, which is going to be used for remittance advices only. And you'd fill in the route number and account number for this particular vendor if you're paying by domestic payment, which I am. And if I was paying by SWIFT or by wire payment, then I'd fill in the charges, whether it's going to be the charges are going to be charged to our account, the beneficiary's account, or they're shared. I'd need to put in the vendor's 2-character country code and the vendor's bank 2 characters country code. And on the additional fields tab, I'd need to fill in their SWIFT or BIC number, which is needed for wire payments. In order to make the entry of the EFT vendor's details simpler, you can export, having created one record, you can export this to Excel. And then export the record. Open that file up in Excel. Remove all unwanted columns. So these extra fields may or may not be needed by other bank account formats, but they're not being used for your domestic payments. So you could remove all these. If we had exported a wire, that would have different columns filled in, and we would need to fill in those particular columns. And these X BSB number and X account number and the remittance password, these are all the encrypted fields, so we would remove those because you don't want to be importing encrypted fields. So this is the bare information that we need for our domestic payments. So you would fill in all your other vendors' details here, for your BSB and account number, you'd fill in the full BSB and account number, and as it's imported, it will be encrypted and masked so that only people with the right ability to view the full BSB and account number will be able to see that. Having filled in your vendor's bank account details for all your EFT vendors on your template, you can then import those records. And you would do the same thing for your EFT customers. Fill in one template record, and again, just like for the vendors, you can either select the AR customer delivery method, which might be print, or the customer's contact, or the customer's company contact, or you could select an EFT email address and specify the email address here. Having created that record, you would export to get a template, edit the template and remove the unwanted columns, and we would remove any encrypted columns as well. And after editing in the relevant bank account details for all your EFT customers, you can then import this file back in. The two other setups that you need to do, which are not in this visual process flow, are for your email remittance advice templates. So in your EFT setup, you can create email messages for your AP and AR remittance advices. And you can include variables from the original source documents in your remittance advices. And the help on the information that you can include is in the F1 help. And the final setup that you can do is the receipts selection codes. EFT is able to pass through outstanding AR invoices based on the criteria that you specify and create a receipt batch applied to those particular invoices. The receipt batch is created against this particular bank with this payment code. And when selecting outstanding invoices, you can specify whether or not you want to skip those customers that are not defined in EFT, or if you want to display an error and abort, or if you're using this just to create a receipt batch, whether or not you're going to direct debit the customers, you could say include the customer anyway, in which case it will create a receipt batch for all customers whose transactions meet the criteria that you have specified here. So you could say, let's do a receipt batch applied to all invoices with this particular terms code, or all outstanding invoices with a balance due by a certain date, any manner of criteria in selecting those particular invoices. And in calculating the amount due, do you want to take up any unapplied credit notes, any prepayments, any unapplied cash or receipts, or any unapplied debit notes? So these could be included or excluded from the creation of the calculation of the receipt amount. And at the time of running, you can also specify certain customers and certain documents to be excluded. But at this stage, we're just setting up a template that we can use later when we come to create a receipt batch. So we've just seen how to install and activate EFT processing, how to check your license, and we've run through the security, the options, creating and setting up of EFT banks, EFT vendors, EFT customers, and we've seen how to set up email messages and receipt selection codes. We're now going to have a look at the transactions using EFT processing and creating EFT files. So we're going to create an AP payment file and a direct debit receipt file. We're also going to see how we can use update invoice due date and create receipt batch. We're also going to take a look at the frequently used EFT reports, for example, the transfers created either in summary or in detail, and how to print advices and email them to customers and vendors. And we're also going to have a look at all the logs that are kept in EFT periodic processing. Back on our EFT processing visual process flow, we're first going to consider accounts payable payments, so payments to vendors via EFT. Initially, you would go into accounts payable and run the create payment batch routine or create an individual payment batch depending on the way you create your payments to vendors. And you would go ahead and post the payments and then come and create an EFT file. Now, if you had said that you can create EFT files from unposted batches, then you needn't do this step here. So if we're going to create an EFT file for an AP payment batch, we can select the batch that we want to create the payment for. In our case, we want to do for batch 26. Because of our control of only being allowed posted batches, we only see posted batches in this finder, and because of our control in EFT options, we can only select a from batch. We can't select a to batch because we said we cannot create a file from a range of batches. And when we selected batch 26, because batch 26 was on our FC bank, it defaulted the format for the CAN CPA 005. Now at this stage, if we wanted to use a different format, for example, we typically use the CAN CPA 005, but for a particular reason we want to use a positive pay format for this particular time, we could overwrite this particular format. So we could choose a positive pay format at this stage. So let's say we want to do the positive pay for the Bank of Montreal, or we leave it at the CAN CPA 005. And would go ahead and create the EFT file. Now this is using the formats.ini, which I will show you shortly, and formatting the EFT details that we've created in EFT vendor in conjunction with the payment details from batch 26 and created those 5 entries in the file. And when we close that screen, we see that the file was created in our AP payments directory, and it was called AP26 CPA, which was the file naming convention that we chose to use. So in our directory for Orchid, EFT Files, AP Payments, we see AP26 CPA, which has just been created. And opening that up, we would see the format of this particular file, which should match the bank specification. For an example on using an EFT Clearing Bank account, we would need to create the payment batch against our bank account EFT Clear. So we could either go into Create Payment Batch and generate the payment batch using EFT Clear as the bank account, or we could go into create a payment entry and just manually create the payments we want. We've created the payments against the EFT Clear bank account, and I've created 2 payments for vendor 1200 and for vendor 1500. So we'd go ahead and post this batch. And because I'd configured the stock code for this for these payments to include a check number, so I can have a reference for my EFT payments, it's defaulting to the next check number. So I'll go ahead and accept that. Preview, and I could print for my records if I wanted to keep this record, and post the batch. So when the batch was posted, we noticed it automatically did a bank entry or a bank transfer between EFT Clear and the real bank account associated with EFT Clear, which is RCCB. So if we go and look at that bank transfer number 1 in Common Services, Bank Services, Bank Transaction Reports, in the CCC Bank we see the transfer with EFT Clear. And in EFT Clear, we see the 2 payments and the transfer to CCB. So the clearing bank account is 0 and the total withdrawal is sitting on CCB. And going to create the EFT file now based on that new batch. It would be our batch 28. And you can see it's defaulting to the CAN CIBC wire MT103, which is what I set up on my EFT Clear bank account, and I could go ahead and create that file. If I came to re-export the same file, for example, batch 28 or batch 26 that I did earlier, if I go to create an EFT file, it will warn me that I've already created this file because it's looking in the EFT create log for history file to see that it's already been created. And you can either say no or yes if you want to recreate that file, in which case that file is overridden. And it is audited that we've now exported that file twice. So viewing the EFT completed logs, we see that we've exported batch 28 twice. And now we could go ahead and email the remittance advices. So again, we would say it's from an AP payment batch. Here we can choose the print destination, which would default to via print preview in my case. Or we could say vendor or customer, and it'll pick it up off the EFT vendor or off the EFT customer. An AP payment batch, the crystal report defaults to what's been set up in EFT options, but we could change it if we have the security clearance to change it. And we could specify the message ID that we want to go with our AP payments and select the batch that we want to send it to. And if I was to go ahead and print, it would email each of those vendors, the 5 vendors in the payment batch, either print or email, depending on the email setting that I'd set up in the EFT vendors. We could also run the EFT reports to see the details of those transfers that have been created, or use the inquiry screen. So this is showing us that we've created one EFT file, the date and time it was run, the total, who it was run by, and the total dollar value of that particular batch. And double-clicking on that would show you the individual payments that made that up, together with all the bank account details that were included at that point in time when we created the file. We also have the EFT Audit Log, which audits date and time for all our EFT vendors and our EFT customers, which bank account details were changed from what to what and by whom. So here we can see from our imports, the fields went from blank to their new value for the customer and all the individual fields. And if we went back and did another amendment to one of these fields, we would see an old value and a new value. And we can filter at the top here to see only selected records, or we could say if we wanted to see all the account numbers that have changed, we could filter using Control F on any column. So filter where account field equals account number, and now we're viewing only those columns, the account number column that's changed and what it's changed from and to on customers and vendors. We could filter as well, do a cumulative filter to say let's only look at vendors as well. So let's filter where it's equal to vendors. So here you can see our filters building up. So we're seeing only the account number field and vendors, and those fields that have been changed, they've been changing from what to what. When we consider the accounts receivable processing, it is the same process. Once we have a receipt batch, we can create an EFT file from that receipt batch, print the advices, and then run any reports that we want to do so. But before we have a receipt batch to post, you may want to use EFT processing to create this receipt batch. And you'd run this process based on the invoice due date. And often invoices are posted with the incorrect due date. So EFT does provide a facility to update the invoice due date. So either by customer and document, or for multiple documents for a customer, you can select to update the invoice due date. So just selecting all the documents that we have for customer 1200. And these are the documents that are still outstanding. So here's the for invoice number 236, etc. Here's the document date. Here's the due date, the document total, and the amount that's been applied and what's still outstanding on those documents. So we could say, for example, change this due date from the 5th of July to the 5th of September. And we could change a couple of documents if we at the same time, and then go process. And this is audited date and time, who changed the due date from what to what. And I'll show you the audit shortly. So if you need to, if you are selecting by due date, you can amend the due dates if they're not correct for at the time of posting. And then you could go ahead and create receipt batch. So when you create receipt batch, you can select from your selection codes. So we created one called direct debit, which is going to create a receipt batch. It's going to include all customers, whether I've defined them in EFT or not. And our default criteria was to select those invoices which are open and which have a terms code. But I know I don't have any with that particular terms code, so I'm just going to select with any terms code, and I'm going to exclude any credit notes or prepayments, unapplied cash or debit notes, and I'm not going to fill in any particular customers. I could, if I want, for example, to say, well, customer 1200, document number, let's say document number invoice 2, for some reason we don't want to include that one in our selection criteria. And when we go ahead and create the receipt batch, it will exclude this particular customer, this particular document. And it will also audit that those were the exclusions that I had at the time of creating the receipt batch. So if I go ahead and click Create Now, it's selecting all my accounts receivable. In fact, it'll be selecting every invoice that is outstanding except for this invoice 2, and it has created that receipt batch in accounts receivable against this particular bank. So if we go to accounts receivable and go to our transactions, go to our receipt batch list, we can see here's our direct debit batch that's just been created, and we could now preview, are these the receipts that we do want to create, and we could amend any, delete any, and then go ahead and post the batch if this was the batch that we wanted to post. And then once batch 38 was posted, we could go back to our process flow, and we would post that AR receipt batch. Then we'd go ahead and create the EFT file, and this time when we choose that we want to be creating from a receipt batch, and we was to select the particular batch that we wanted to create from, it would do the same process in creating an EFT file to the bank, instructing the bank to do those direct debits for us. So this is the EFT, the audit log that is kept date and time when the create receipt batch routine was run. And if we double click on that, we see the exclusions that were the documents that were excluded at that point in time. And in the all these columns, we see what documents we were selecting. So in our case, all invoices which were open. And we also have the audit trail of who updated which invoice documents, the due date from what to what. So admin on these date and times updated the invoice document due date on invoice 2 and 3 from the 5th of July to the 5th of September. We have seen how to use EFT processing and the EFT transactions, how to create an EFT file, how to update the invoice due date, and how to create a receipt batch if you want to use that AR functionality. We've also seen the transfers created and transfer created detail, and how to print advices and email to your customers and vendors. We've also reviewed some of the EFT audit logs on the files created, on who amended which banking account details at what point in time, on updating the invoice due date, and on running the create receipt batch log. Now we're going to have a look at the EFT bank formats and how to create custom bank formats if you need to. We'll review the structure of the formats.ini, how to create a custom user formats.ini, and where you can put these files if you want to work with Sage 300 customization directories. And we'll also have a quick look at the default remittance advices for vendor remittances, customer refund advices, and customer direct deposit advices. When you open the Create EFT file, you may find that the formats.ini gets reloaded. This will happen either when you load a product update and there is a more up-to-date formats.ini in the product update than what you had on the system, or if we've sent you a new formats.ini which contains new formats for you to use. So EFT processing will compare the date and time of the formats.ini on disk to the formats.ini which is in the database, and if the disk one is later, it will reload the formats.ini for you to select the formats and get the most up-to-date format that has been released. This process will happen either when you go into the Create EFT file and the EFT file format field becomes active, or when you go into EFT Options when you first open up the EFT Options screen. The formats.ini is a text file which will be found in your Programs directory. And you can place a shortcut to the formats.ini on your Sage 300 desktop. The first part of the formats.ini are comments, date and time when we added particular formats in the bank. But looking at the Canadian CPA 005 as an example, the bank format name is enclosed in square brackets, and that is the indicator of the start of a new bank format. The EFT file format on the bank is what drives the labeling of the field labels on the EFT Bank screen and perhaps provides optional help like this particular one on the data center code. It is the EFT file type on the options, the primary bank tab, that drives the field labeling on the EFT customer and the EFT vendor. But for the bank, it is this particular EFT file type that drives the labeling on this particular bank. So we can see the BSB number, which is the bank branch number, has been relabeled to Financial Institution ID Transit Number. The word number has been truncated. And the account number field has been relabeled Account Number. For EFT Banks, we have 4 optional fields: Bank Extra 1, Bank Extra 2, Bank Extra 3, Bank Extra 4, plus a Bank AP and a Bank AR payment reference field. And the Bank AP payment reference field has been relabeled Originator ID Number, and the Bank AR payment field has been relabeled Originator Number. PR relates to payroll. And the Bank Extra 1 field has been relabeled Destination Data Center Code, as we can see here. And if you use the word tip after a field name, then it will highlight or hyperlink the field name and then place your text into the help. So here we can see, please contact your bank for the Destination Data Center Code. And Bank Extra 2 in this case has been relabeled short name 15 characters. The customer payment reference and the vendor payment reference is referring to the EFT vendor and the EFT customer screen. We can also validate the length of the fields in the EFT file as it's being exported. So for the financial institution ID or the branch code, it has been validated that it must be between 8 and 9 digits long. So if it was 7 or less or 10 or more, you would get an error message and the EFT file would not be created. And the account size has been validated from 3 to 12 characters long. If you needed additional or different validations, for example, you had an account a number that was 2 digits long, we could change this to 2, but it's recommended you do that in your user formats.ini, as it is a custom specific change that you're doing, because next time you load a new version of EFT or a product update of EFT, the original standard format will be overridden if you do the change in the formats.ini. You're then able to format the data according to what the bank requires the format to be. For example, it needs a file creation number which is 4 digits long and right justified with leading zeros. It needs a file creation date, and it's using a Julian format for the dates, which is a 5-digit number. And for the payroll, it's needing the payroll period end date formatted in this particular format, DDMMYYYY. And then you have rows, header rows, detail rows for AP, detail rows for AR, footer rows for AP, footer rows for AR. And if you are using payroll, you can also format your payroll rows in the certain ways. And then you would include the fields in the format that the bank requires. In this particular format, the header row starts with a 10 zeros, a 1, then it's the originator number, which is 10 characters, the file creation number, which is 4 characters or 4 digits, the file creation date, which is a 0 leading a Julian date, the data center number, which is 5 digits, etc., with all the fields that they require. And after the heading row, we get the specification for the detail AP, which is each payment, what the details are, detail AR, so this is each direct deposit, and then the footer AP, which includes a record count, the originator number, file creation number, and so on, the footer AR, etc. For more help on these formats, you can consult the F1 help. If you do want to create your own variation of a specific format, for example, this CAN CPA 005, what you can do is copy the format and then paste that into a new file format and save this file as userformats.ini. Put this file format in the same place as your formats.ini, so in the EL programs directory. And call it userformats.ini. And then you can do any changes that you want. So in the example where we want to allow an account size which is 2 digits long, we could say from 2 to 12. And if we wanted another change to this particular format, perhaps we wanted a different originator ID field to be placed here, or whatever the requirement that you have, you would make these changes and then save the file. When I next open the options or my EFT Banks, it will reload the formats.ini. So it's not just the formats.ini, but it's also any user formats.ini that get loaded into the database. And the way EFT works is it first looks for a user formats.ini with the EFT file type that you have specified, and it will use that one if it can. Otherwise, if it finds one, otherwise it will use the EFT file type found in the formats.ini. And if you are working with Sage customization directories, so in the admin services customization directories, if you do have specific customization directories either for the user ID or for the company ID, you can place your user formats.ini in those EL in the customization folder ELXXA2. So the precedence of formats.ini is it'll first look in your customization directory for a user formats.ini for the current user/company combination. If it finds one, it will use it. If it doesn't, it will revert back to the EFT programs directory and look first for a user formats.ini. If it finds one for that particular file type, it'll use it. Otherwise, it'll revert back to the formats.ini, which is the original file released by Orchid Systems. The EFT Remittance Advices, both the EFT Remittance Advice for vendor payments, the EFT Remittance Advice for customer direct debits, or the EFT Remittance Advice for customer refunds, are crystal reports that you can customize to include your own logos and or own information in these reports. If you click on the F1 Help for the remittance on the default advice screen, you can find help on the different remittance advices. So the difference between the ELPA Pay 01, 02, 03, and 4 is largely the different dates that you can use. So the EFT, the payment date is based on the batch date, or the payment date is based on the date and time the file was created, or the payment date is based on the batch entry date. For the direct debit remittance advices, ELREC01, the payment date is based on the date and time the EFT file was created, but it is using the EFT log creation number in the file. So if you have not yet created the EFT file, this record will be blank. Whereas ELREC02, the payment date is also based on the date and time you created the EFT file, and the EFT bank account details are taken from the audit log, not from the EFT customer record. And for refunds, ELREF01, the payment date is based on the date and time the EFT file was created, and the customer bank account details are taken from the EFT customer record. Whereas for ELREF02, the payment date is also based on the date and time the EFT file was created, but the EFT customer bank account details are taken from the audit table. So if you had changed the bank account details on the EFT customer since the file was created, you would not get the same details for your bank account. We have seen the structure of the formats.ini and how to create a user formats.ini and where to put these files if you are working with Sage customization directories. We've also had a look at the default remittance advices for vendor payments, customer refunds, and customer direct deposits. Thanks very much for watching this training video on EFT. If you need more information on EFT processing, please go to our website, orchid.systems, select EFT processing from the Sage add-ons by product name, and you will find brochures, the EFT ROI calculator, case studies, the product positioning demo, and the product demonstration video.